Hey guys, welcome to this week's small group Bible study. I want to just start out by saying I really hope you enjoyed the sermon this last week on David and Goliath. And for this week, what we're going to do is go back a few chapters, and we're going to look at the story of Jonathan. You need to know about Jonathan because Jonathan was King Saul's son. And this story just happens a few chapters before David and Goliath. And it's an important story because we begin to see the heart of Jonathan. Read 1 Samuel chapter 14, verses 1 through 14. And what I want you to do is read this story from a military point of view and ask yourself, does this strategy make any logical sense? And then also I want you to recall the story of David and Goliath. How are Jonathan and David similar? What I'm hoping that you see is that this story makes absolutely no military sense at all. The only thing that they had going for them was their element of surprise. Everything else was against them. And they end up giving up their element of surprise. Why would they do that? I mean, their enemy has the high ground. There's more of the enemy. There's 10 times more of the enemy than there is of him. But yet he decides to show himself. Second thing I want you to see is that if the Philistines gave up their superior position, Jonathan would have retreated. Now, you would have thought that if the Philistines would have climbed down on the rocks, right, and they would have become tired from all of that, that would have been the right time to attack them. But instead, Jonathan says, no, if that happens, we're going to retreat. But if the Philistines kept their position, Jonathan would attack. Which means, and we see in verse 13, he climbed with his hands and his feet. Probably had to climb up a sheer rock face to get at them. Probably they were throwing things at him, maybe even shooting arrows at him. And even after all of that, when he gets up there, he had to be exhausted, but God gave him the strength to overcome 20 men. David and Jonathan both demonstrate what a man after God's own heart looks like. And sometimes a man after God's own heart doesn't always do the logical thing, but he does what God has placed on his heart. What I want you to notice is that in verse 7, the armor bearer is with Jonathan. Literally in the Greek, it reads, I am with you like your heart is with you. What do you think inspired such loyalty to Jonathan? And what might a person after God's own heart look like in today's culture? And finally, how do we inspire loyalty among God's people today? As we get into this next reading, I want you to know that King Saul, who is also Jonathan's father, after this story is rejected as king over Israel by God. Why? Because King Saul was not a man after God's own heart. He didn't have God's heart in mind when he made decisions. But young David is anointed as the future and the new king over Israel. And we heard the story this last Sunday that when King Saul is too afraid to confront Goliath, David steps in to slay Goliath and save Israel. So now all of that has happened, and David has just slayed Goliath, and he's been chasing down and killing the Philistines who were threatening the people of God. And so what I want you to do is read 1 Samuel chapter 18, verses 1 through 12. Why do you think Jonathan loved David so much? And why is it significant that Jonathan gave clothing and weapons to King David? I hope you came to the conclusion that David and Jonathan had the same courageous spirit, and they were both men after God's own heart. They had that in common. And because they had that same spirit, man, they were fast friends as soon as they met. When Jonathan gave David the prince's clothing and weapons, it was a confirmation from God that David was truly the next king over Israel. So why is King Saul jealous and afraid of David? And why do you think Jonathan was not afraid of David? I also want to ask you two more questions. When a competitor is successful in our lives, do we tend to respond more like King Saul or more like Jonathan? And what does our reaction say about our trust in God? As the story progresses, King Saul becomes more jealous of David and finally plots to kill him. Jonathan he's caught in between a rock and a hard place, because on the one side, Jonathan loves and admires his father, but he also loves David. So David comes up to Jonathan. He says, listen, your dad is trying to kill me. And Jonathan's like, no, I don't believe it. I don't think my dad would do that. And so finally, Jonathan and David devise a test to bring out King Saul's true intentions when it comes to David. So what I want you to do is read 1 Samuel chapter 20, verses 27 through 34. What and who is Jonathan having to make a choice between? What I want you to notice is that Jonathan has to choose between his father and his best friend. Jonathan has to choose between inheriting the throne and giving it to a friend. Jonathan also has to choose between his father's plans and God's plans. How is it possible for Jonathan to make such a selfless decision? And how is Jonathan a lot like Jesus? I think what made Jonathan different is that Jonathan's heart for God allowed him to sacrifice his future so David could be king. See, Jonathan was a man after God's own heart. And Jesus' heart for God the Father allowed him to sacrifice his life so we could be God's children. And that's how they're similar. Jonathan was willing to give up his kingship so that someone else could be king. And when Jesus sacrificed his life, he gave us the right to become royalty because we become children of the King. As we get into this next section, there's a lot of reading on this one, but I didn't want to cut it down because there's just so much in these passages, and I really believe that they'll encourage your heart today. After Jonathan helps David escape, King Saul hunts David down relentlessly. In fact, King Saul becomes so evil that he even slaughters 85 innocent priests as he pursues David. So what I want you to do is read 1 Samuel chapter 24, verses 1 through 22. A lot of verses, but a great story. And I want you to ask this question. If you were David, would you have killed King Saul? Why or why not? And what might the unbelieving world say about David's unwillingness to kill King Saul? Last two questions for this week. What does David's actions say about his trust in God? And finally, how can we apply this kind of trust to God in our lives today? We don't find ourselves in the exact same situation that David was in, but there are similarities to our life. How do we apply this to our life? Have a great discussion and a great rest of the week.